Oliver Thompson has been a ranger for 5 years. The ranger squad was organized by local authorities to protect wildlife from poaching. He moved to a small town in northern Montana from Ohio and never regretted it. Oliver liked to walk along the forest paths, inhaling the intoxicating smell of pine trees and decomposing leaves as he made his way through the thickets. The young ranger believed in justice more than anything, therefore he never acted illegally in order to protect the land he was entrusted with. It was in the forest that Oliver's soul rested. It is where he cherished every moment. Over time, the man who grew up in a big city perfectly learned the habits of animals and birds. This made him one of the top specialists in his field. Few people knew that in his previous life, Oliver Thompson was a successful lawyer with an extensive client base and a good reputation. The young lawyer had everything that a man his age could dream of: a beloved wife, a big house, and an expensive car. Everything changed in an instant when Oliver's wife died in a car accident. It was not the young woman's fault. It just so happened that on that fateful day, a driver who was driving under the influence got onto the highway. When the paramedics arrived, Laura Thompson was still alive. The young woman spent 3 days in the intensive care unit, connected to life support. All that time, Oliver never did leave her side. The man mobilized all of his connections and genuinely believed that his wife could be saved. Unfortunately, despite the doctor's best efforts, Laura died on the 4th day after the accident. Oliver was distraught with grief. The news of his wife's passing was a strong blow that deeply unsettled him. The young lawyer had trouble remembering what happened next. The funeral arrangements and tear-stained faces of his relatives and friends, all mixed into a single picture of longing and heartache. Oliver grieved for months and tried to find solace at the bottom of a whiskey bottle. Of course, this affected his work and state of mind. At some point, Oliver got sick of everything. The big house, the money in his bank, and the expensive car lost their value in an instant. Why own all these riches if you can't share them with a loved one? It was then that the young lawyer decided to leave for Montana, cutting off his ties with his family and colleagues. After selling all of his possessions, Oliver bought a house near the forest and became a ranger. At first, the locals were wary of the gloomy, silent man whom they believed Oliver to be. But after they got to know him better, they gained a lot of respect for him. The young ranger was appreciated for the fact that he never took shortcuts. He always acted righteously and would do everything in his power to protect the wildlife. Being given such an important role, Oliver took his duties seriously. Every day he walked the land that he was entrusted with. His loyal dog Buddy helped him in this mission. More than anything, Buddy loved making forays in the forest. In the forest, it was possible to chase squirrels and hares, knowing full well that catching them was impossible. Oliver treated his pet with understanding and never scolded him for displaying his hunting instincts. Together, they walked along the forest paths for many miles and became very attached to each other. Since it was not only difficult but also dangerous to be in the forest alone without a dog, Oliver would always bring Buddy along with him. That fateful, beautiful autumn day was no exception. As usual, Oliver let the dog go ahead, trusting his scent and hunting instinct. His exceptional hunting instincts could be explained by the fact that Buddy was half dog, half wolf. A couple of years ago, his mother was lured into the forest by wolves, who, in search of better hunting grounds, wandered into these parts of the forest. Sometime later, the dog returned home with the small puppy in her mouth. Seeing that image made an old ranger tear up. Charles Mitchell did not keep the puppy and gave it to a younger ranger. The old man was somewhat afraid of Buddy, who he believed might have inherited the characteristics of his wolf dad. By gifting the puppy to Oliver, the old man didn't have to worry about the animal. In spite of what was expected of him, the half-dog took a liking to the young ranger and became his true friend. Oliver followed Buddy into the forest, placing all of his trust in him. Oliver knew that if something were to happen, the dog would sense danger and warn him in time. Oliver followed a familiar path and made notes in his notebook from time to time. His tenacious, trained eye noticed the smallest details and subtleties: a fallen tree, a broken branch, or flattened grass. Oliver knew that the forest does not like carelessness, and in order to survive in it, you need to be attentive to detail. The ranger walked for about half a mile before Buddy became visibly agitated. The fur on the dog's back instantly stood up, which immediately alerted Oliver. "What happened, Buddy? What do you smell?" Oliver asked in a whisper. Of course, the dog could not answer his owner, but he did everything in his power to ensure that Oliver took notice of the nearest bushes. "Let's see what the issue is," thought Oliver, and carefully parted the branches of the thorny bush. What the young ranger saw totally shocked him. A young woman was tied to the trunk of a tree growing in the center of the clearing. But that wasn't even the most shocking part. To Oliver's great surprise, the young woman was pregnant. Seeing the ranger in front of her, the young woman shuddered and looked deep into his eyes. "I'm going to free you now. Just wait a minute," said Oliver in a quivering voice. He took out a knife and quickly cut the rope with which the woman was tied to the tree. The young woman almost lost her balance after being in that uncomfortable position for so long. Had Oliver not been there to catch her, she would have certainly fallen to the ground. "Who did this to you?" the ranger asked as softly as possible. "It was my husband, David. He was after my money," said the young woman, mustering up a little strength before fainting. Oliver looked at Buddy, who was wagging his tail. He picked up the young woman and started heading towards the edge of the forest. The young ranger could not wrap his head around the fact that someone could do that to a woman carrying his child. Having placed the young woman in the back seat of his SUV, which he had prudently parked at the end of the forest, Oliver drove towards the nearest clinic. Oliver knew that the young woman needed qualified assistance and that only a certified doctor could give it. Nevertheless, the staff of the clinic were shocked when they saw a pregnant woman in the arms of a ranger at their door. Fortunately, a medical examination determined that both the woman and the baby were fine. The only thing that worried the doctors was the mental state of the young woman. They learned that her name was Julia Bronson. 2 years ago, she lost her father to an insidious hereditary disease. Julia's mother died during childbirth due to internal bleeding. Therefore, for many years, Julia's only relative was her dad. Larry Bronson was a wealthy oil man with an 8-figure net worth. After his death, he unwittingly turned Julia into one of the most desirable women in northeast Montana. Julia's money attracted a young crook named David White. David was an experienced swindler. He charmed Julia with his tenderness and care. After she began to trust him, he proceeded to implement his insidious plan. To begin with, David convinced Julia that they needed to make their relationship official and get married. At the same time, most of Julia's acquaintances tried to warn her that David was likely not who he seemed to be. But Julia really wanted to start a family and couldn't imagine doing it with anyone other than David. They had an extravagant wedding, which impressed even the sophisticated friends and acquaintances of the late Larry Bronson. David first began to take over his wife's business by becoming very close to her dad's network. At first, Julia resisted, but when she found out that she was pregnant, she happily handed over the reins to her husband. If only she knew that David had a long-term girlfriend on the side, with whom he had already pulled off several such scams. Once at breakfast, he asked, "Honey, why don't we go out to nature? We'll unwind, sit by a fire, or fish. We haven't done anything like it for a long time." "Of course, my love. Let's do it. It's so fun to spend time together," Julia answered, not realizing the trap she was falling into. 2 days later, the young couple was driving towards the forest, talking about anything and everything, laughing and being happy. Julia's joy was sincere, but David's fiend delight was suspicious. The swindler had already found a quiet place ahead of time in which he planned to abandon his wife. Being a naturally weak person, David was afraid of blood. Therefore, he decided to get rid of Julia in a slightly different way. Let the forest animals do the work for me. Everyone knows that the forests of Montana are teeming with wolves and bears, David thought, rubbing his hands. He did not even care that Julia was pregnant with his child. David completely lacked paternal instincts and was willing to do anything for the sake of money. Having lured his wife into the forest, he overpowered her and tied her to a tree. "Sorry, it's nothing personal. I just really need your father's money," David said and waved goodbye to his wife. Julia told this story to the police officer who took her statement in the hospital. "Wow, I'm so sorry that the man you trusted turned out to be so evil. I can't believe that such evil even exists. I guarantee you one thing. The scumbag will receive a lot of sentence for attempted murder. The state prison district will ensure that it will be harsh," said the policeman after collecting all the necessary information. Julia smiled slyly and closed her eyes. At that point, she was least concerned about the length of David's sentences. She kept glancing at the door, hoping to see the ranger who had saved her from certain death. Oliver came to visit only 2 days later, when Julia was feeling a bit better. The young ranger brought a bouquet of wildflowers that the nurse immediately placed in water. "Here's my savior," Julia said, smiling. "Come on, me? It was all Buddy. If it weren't for him, I would have never found you," Oliver answered embarrassedly. After that, the young people exchanged glances and, without saying a word, laughed in unison. That day, they chatted until the evening and would have probably talked all night had the nurse not sent the ranger home. Since then, Oliver visited Julia almost every day. The young woman spent about a week in the hospital, after which she was released. "We hope that the next time we see you here is when it is time for you to give birth. Make sure to get plenty of rest in the meantime," the nurse on duty said with a smile. Julia looked shyly at Oliver, who was standing by her side, and nodded his head. She had already made up her own mind to stay with the young ranger. The young woman liked this calm man who exuded strength and confidence. It is worth saying that their admiration was mutual, and Oliver felt the same towards her. They cherished every day they spent together. The young couple, to Buddy's delight, decided to stay in the house at the edge of the forest. Believing in the strength of their relationship, Oliver confidently declared that he was ready to become a father to Julia's child. 2 months later, Julia gave birth to a beautiful son, whom the loving mother named Oliver Jr. in honor of his savior. Holding his newborn son for the first time, the young ranger expressed a depth of feelings he never knew possible. Next to him, Buddy jumped and squealed, wanting to lick the baby on the cheek. Smiling happily, Julia and Oliver left the hospital to the thunderous applause of the medical staff of the maternity ward. The couple looked forward to a life of mutual tenderness and love, which both of them had dreamed of for so many years.